The air in the apostolic press chamber was heavy before the confrontation even began. It wasn't the weight of heat or humidity, but something older, something ancient. The kind of tension that lives between stone walls and whispered prayers, where history breathes and prophecy listens. The cameras had only just started rolling when it happened. A voice rose, not with reverence, not with respect, but with the precision of a blade. It belonged to Dr. Amir Khalidi, the celebrated Middle Eastern archaeologist known as much for his televised arrogance as for his expertise in sacred architecture. He did not wait to be called on. He stood abruptly, papers in hand, gaze locked on the man at the podium, the vicar of Christ himself. "You're manipulating prophecy," he said. No soft lead-in, no academic decorum, just the accusation, bare and loud enough to kill every whisper in the room. The Pope had been mid-sentence, describing the mysterious tremors beneath the ancient eastern gate of Jerusalem, a gate long sealed in stone, untouched since the 16th century, prophesied by Jews, Christians, and even Muslims to remain closed until the arrival of the Messiah. But now, reports whispered of movement. Tiny fractures, shifts in the foundation, stone that should have stayed silent, breathing. And the man who dared say it aloud, publicly, officially, was Pope Leo XIV. To those in the chamber, it felt like heresy wrapped in holiness. The world had barely recovered from his last declaration, one that shook both Vatican halls and geopolitical circles. And now this, confirmation, or something close to it, that a sealed gate was no longer still. Khalidi's voice was sharpened by decades of secular confidence. "You're feeding hysteria," he said. "People will take your words and believe the end has come." He expected a rebuttal, a theological detour, maybe even a Vatican handler stepping forward to deflect. But none came. Pope Leo did not flinch. He didn't narrow his eyes. He didn't so much as sigh. He simply let the accusation land and waited in it, as if the insult had not bruised, but clarified. Then, with a stillness that seemed older than his years, he raised his hand, not in defense, not to silence, but to point. He gestured toward no man, no map, no scripture, only eastward, and then, calm as if stating the temperature in the room, "Then explain," he said, "why the sealed gate is shifting." No thunder followed, no trumpet blew, but the silence that fell in that moment was louder than any applause. It was the silence of people realizing they just crossed into something different. Not argument, not politics, not superstition, but sign. There was no laughter from Khalidi, no immediate follow-up, just the sound of a journalist's pen falling to the floor and a cameraman forgetting to refocus his lens. The ancient gate in question stood thousands of miles away, but somehow, in that Vatican room, its stones felt closer than ever. And for the first time in decades, no one was entirely sure what was metaphor and what was movement. If you felt it too, that sense that something is changing, that prophecy is no longer buried in books, but pressing through headlines and holy places, then ask yourself, why haven't you subscribed to Holy Shadows? Because silence won't shield you from what's coming. And if you refuse to subscribe, if you sit in certainty that none of this matters, then go to the comments. Say it proudly. Let the world read why you chose comfort over conviction. He had warned them, quietly at first, then openly, not with fanaticism, but with a calm urgency that made men lean in despite themselves. Pope Leo XIV was no stranger to suspicion. To some, he was the most theologically grounded pope in half a century. To others, he was the most dangerous, not because he challenged doctrine, but because he revived it in a world that preferred forgetting. He'd spent years among the forgotten, war-torn villages in Syria, Christian enclaves in northern Iraq, settlements tucked into the cracked stone of the Judean wilderness. He spoke Arabic like a native, Hebrew with the fluency of a scholar, and Latin with the weight of tradition. But it was his silence, the way he let moments breathe, the way he allowed truth to land without embellishment, that unnerved the powerful. There were records, of course, photographs of him kneeling before the Eastern Gate under moonlight in 1998. Reports, quiet, redacted, of his private consultations with Orthodox rabbis and Muslim historians. For decades, the gate had been a historical curiosity, but to Leo, it had always been something more, a symbol not of myth, but of alignment, a promise, of pressure building behind prophecy. His homilies in recent months had grown more pointed, less abstract. He'd spoken of portals once sealed beginning to sigh, and thresholds not built by men, yet shifting under their feet. At first, the cardinals thought it poetic license. Then came the seismic readings from beneath the Temple Mount, slight, inexplicable. Then the reports of guards stationed at the gate witnessing fine dust falling at dawn, unshaken by any wind. And now, this press event. It had not been designed as a confrontation. It had been called as a theological address. Quiet, contained, a closed list of attendees, theologians, Vatican correspondents, religious diplomats. But word had spread, and with word came Khalidi. Dr. Amir Khalidi was the darling of the international academic elite, fluent in 7 languages, chair of UNESCO's Cultural Preservation Commission, author of Jerusalem Without the Myths. He walked into the apostolic palace with a practiced smile and a private certainty that faith, when pressed, would always yield to reason. He'd studied the same sites, touched the same stones. But where Leo saw signs, Khalidi saw sediment. Where Leo heard echoes, Khalidi heard echoes of delusion. He did not believe in the return of the Messiah. He believed in the return of fear. And fear, he believed, had just been reignited from the Vatican itself. So when Pope Leo spoke of the Eastern Gate as something responding, not to weather, not to war, but to time, Khalidi rose. Not with curiosity, but with the confidence of a man certain he was swatting down superstition. And yet, even he hadn't expected the room to shift. The moment Leo raised his hand and said, "Then explain why the sealed gate is shifting," something ancient entered the air. It wasn't science or superstition. It was weight, a weight that made men reconsider whether they were spectators or witnesses. This moment mattered because no pope had dared speak this way since 1967, since the Six-Day War reopened Jerusalem's gates and biblical language re-entered diplomatic halls. Even then, the Vatican had tread carefully. Official neutrality, scriptural symbolism, nothing literal. But Leo didn't speak in parables anymore. And Khalidi, he wasn't just challenging the Pope. He was challenging prophecy itself. He didn't come to ask. He came to disarm. But what he met wasn't blind faith. It was something colder, older, something not interested in applause. Journalists knew they were recording history. The cameras rolled. Pens scribbled half-believing. But no one dared move too quickly, because it was dawning on them all, in real time. The Pope wasn't speculating. He was confirming. If you're still watching, still listening, then ask yourself why. Why does this hold your attention when so many things don't? Why does your heart slow, your eyes narrow? We cover what the world's mainstream won't, because we're not trying to control the narrative. We're trying to follow the signs. So if that matters to you, if you want to hear what others are too afraid to say, subscribe to Holy Shadows now. And if it doesn't matter to you, if you choose to turn away, then go to the comments. Tell us why you're okay ignoring the shaking of foundations. Tell us why, when the gate stirs, you remain still. The silence had broken, but it had not vanished. It had thinned, like a veil drawn back, just enough for conflict to enter. Cameras clicked again, but slower now, like hands unsure whether they were documenting a scandal or a revelation. The room, once filled with the soft shuffling of paper and polite reverence, had begun to settle into a different posture, one of wariness. Tension now wore the shape of civility. Dr. Khalidi did not raise his voice again. He didn't need to. He had stirred the waters, and now he waded in, calculating, composed. He folded his hands over the mic and tilted his head, as if attempting politeness, though the edge in his tone made it clear the courtesy was performative. "Your Holiness," he began, "surely you know the Eastern Gate has always been closed. Ottoman sealed, centuries old, reinforced over time. What's changed besides imagination?" The challenge was layered. To the casual observer, it sounded like a measured academic question. But to those who listened closely, it was a scalpel, an accusation veiled as curiosity. Khalidi was not attacking the evidence. He was attacking belief. He expected Leo to defend himself, to appeal to metaphor, to soften his stance, to step back into the safe territory of symbolism where modern popes had long taken shelter. But Pope Leo XIV did not retreat. He turned his gaze to Khalidi, not with the weariness of a man under pressure, but with the sorrow of a shepherd watching someone speak confidently in the dark. Imagination, the Pope said, doesn't move 12-ton stones. No anger, no sarcasm, just that. An anchor dropped into the center of the room. Khalidi blinked. Only once, but in that blink, something shifted. He hadn't expected a reply, so unembellished, so free of nervous qualifiers. He leaned in again, his lips curling slightly into a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then perhaps, he offered, Your Holiness might explain why so many faithful are now preparing for the end of the world. Are we to take this movement, he gestured vaguely eastward, as apocalyptic? He paused, just long enough for the question to hover like smoke. Because if the Church begins invoking the end times, history tells us panic follows. The provocation was clear. His words carried the implication that faith bred hysteria, that prophecy served fear, and that the Pope was fanning an old and dangerous fire. Again, Leo did not raise his voice. He didn't even shift his stance. He spoke with the gravity of a man who had buried children in Aleppo, held the hands of widows in Mosul, and baptized orphans under collapsing roofs. Hope, he said slowly, is not hysteria. It is preparation. He let the phrase breathe, long enough for its weight to land. Hysteria is what happens when people aren't told the truth. Panic comes from surprises. But faith, true faith, prepares without panic. It watches. It listens. And when the stone stirs, it does not run. It kneels. There was no applause. The room didn't need it. Even Khalidi felt it. The strength not of a debater, but of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to preserve. His smirk faded just slightly into thought. The journalists behind him scribbled faster now. Some looked at each other, unsure how to interpret what they were witnessing. Was this a theological defense? A prophetic alarm? Or something more ancient? A confrontation between reason sharpened by pride and wisdom born from suffering? Pope Leo offered no diagram, no data, no flash. He offered clarity. And in a world starved of it, even the skeptics could not look away. You're still watching for a reason, not out of boredom, not out of curiosity, but because somewhere deep inside, you feel it too, that press behind the veil, that shift in the wind, that tremor beneath the surface of normal life. You don't need to be convinced. You need to be awake. So if you're still pretending nothing is happening, ask yourself why. Subscribe to Holy Shadows now, because you already know this isn't just a story. And if you still won't, go to the comments. Explain why you're comfortable sitting in silence, while the gate itself groans to speak. The polished calm of diplomacy had thinned to a fragile shell, and Khalidi was the first to crack it. He leaned forward now, not in curiosity, but in challenge. His voice had lost its earlier smoothness. The edge had sharpened. It was no longer enough to dismiss the Pope's words as poetic or abstract. The implications were too real, and the man delivering them too unshaken. You want the world to panic over a gate, Khalidi said, the syllables clipped and deliberate. You want mothers in Jerusalem and Cairo and Rome to believe the end is coming because of a tremor in old stone. It was no longer a question. It was an accusation. The journalists flinched, not from volume, but from tone. It was the sound of ideology shedding civility. You're manipulating prophecy, he continued, to stir unrest. This is theological nationalism disguised as mysticism. You're feeding extremism, Your Holiness. Pope Leo did not react with offense. He didn't glance at his aides, didn't scan the crowd for support. He turned his full face toward Khalidi, not as an opponent, but as a man who had long expected this moment. And then, softly, yet with a clarity that stretched to the walls. The gate, he said, doesn't belong to Rome. There was a stillness in that sentence. Not emptiness, stillness. The kind found in tombs, in sanctuaries, in holy places just before something sacred breaks through. It doesn't belong to Christendom or to the Vatican. It doesn't belong to Zion or to politics or to any narrative shaped by man's ambition. He took a slow step forward. It belongs to prophecy. The word struck differently. Not like a weapon, but like a tolling bell, ancient, unignorable. Khalidi opened his mouth, then closed it. His hands clenched the edge of the table as the Pope continued, his voice no longer soft, but steady, as if reciting not memory, but witness. In 1998, Leo said, "Long before I ever wore this ring, I walked the old city of Jerusalem in silence. No cameras, no vestments, only the robe of a missionary and the heart of a man searching." He paused, not for effect, but remembrance. I knelt at the eastern gate just before dawn. Dust clung to the stones. The silence was dense. And in that silence, I heard what no one could explain. He looked to the gathered crowd now, not just Khalidi, not voices, not visions, but murmurs deep below, a trembling that was not from trucks or footsteps or wind, a groaning beneath the earth like pressure waiting to break. He let that hang, long enough for the memory to become their memory. Later, in the streets, Arab locals, Muslim families spoke of the same thing. Quietly, reverently. They didn't use our words. But they knew. The earth was shifting, and it wasn't geological. Khalidi scoffed. Too loud, too quick. A man cornered by something he could not catalog. "This is madness," he said. "You're weaponizing the return of Christ, turning faith into fire." Leo turned back to him, his face unchanged. "No," he said. "I'm reminding the world that some things can't be governed, only discerned." He stepped away from the podium, slowly. "Politics divides, but prophecy," he said, with weight behind each word, "unites those with ears to hear." There was no applause. There never is when the air is too thick to breathe. Some of the reporters stopped taking notes. Others simply stared. A Vatican aide near the edge of the platform bowed her head, not in defeat, but in prayer. Khalidi's frustration had boiled to the surface. His intellect, so potent in books and lectures, found no traction here. Because the man he challenged wasn't playing the game. This wasn't debate. It was declaration, and the tremors were no longer beneath the gate. They were beneath him. Holy Shadows doesn't profit off fear. We don't speak to the algorithms. We speak to the silence the world tries to ignore. If that matters to you, subscribe. And if it doesn't, if you still believe silence is safer than truth, go to the comments. Tell us why you'd rather trust stillness over signs. Say it clearly, so the rest of us know who's willing to watch as the gate begins to groan. There's always a moment, brief, sharp, when pretense gives way to panic. Dr. Khalidi's voice had been careful until now, guarded beneath layers of intellectual formality and professional restraint. But that mask cracked, and when it did, it shattered completely. He leaned forward, his tone louder now, not theatrical, but visceral. "So you're saying Jesus is about to return?" he demanded. "That this tremor, this stone shifting in Jerusalem, this proves it." The word Jesus hung differently in his mouth, clipped clinical like a name that did not belong to him. There was no more sarcasm in him now, only alarm dressed as outrage. And still, Pope Leo said nothing. He stood from his place, not urgently, but deliberately. Every movement felt liturgical, not political. He did not raise his hands. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked out over the hall, first toward Khalidi, then toward the cameras, then finally toward the east-facing windows that let in the dying Roman light. "When the gate trembles," he said slowly, "it isn't the walls that fear, it's the watchers." There was no noise, no fidgeting. Even the cameraman stood still. Khalidi opened his mouth to object, but Leo didn't stop. He spoke now not to one man, but to all present, his tone no longer pastoral, but prophetic. "We have seismic data," he said, "from beneath the Temple Mount. Readings that indicate movement, not erosion, not construction, not decay, but pressure. Directional. Vertical. He turned his head slightly, allowing the truth to land where it would. We have testimony. Jewish mystics from Safed who for years spoke of signs in the stone, of light beneath the gate. Even imams in East Jerusalem who've quietly warned their congregations, do not touch it. It waits for someone. A low murmur stirred in the back, quickly silenced by an unseen hand. Leo continued. They all speak in different tongues, but the meaning is the same. The Eastern Gate has remained sealed not by architecture, but by providence, and it will not open until the one appointed to pass through it approaches. Then he looked at Khalidi again. No contempt, no triumph, only certainty. So call it myth. But when myth begins to move, who are we to laugh? And with those words, the room broke into a silence deeper than any that had come before. Not a passive silence, but a charged one. The kind of silence that fills confessionals before the penitent speaks. The kind that descends over graveyards just before thunder breaks. The kind that does not ask for attention, it demands it. Khalidi did not answer. He stared, blinking once, as if trying to recalibrate a reality that had shifted beneath his feet. Because it had. No one clapped. No one dared. Because applause would have made it smaller. Journalists who had arrived hungry for headlines now sat slack-jawed, unsure whether they were witnessing history or prophecy, or both. A woman in the third row crossed herself instinctively. A diplomat whispered a verse under his breath. One cameraman, unnoticed, turned off his equipment and simply listened. This was no longer about one gate, or one pope, or one press room. It was about whether we are still capable of awe. And you, watching this now, you feel it too. You feel the pressure behind the veil, the trembling just beneath what the world pretends is stable. You feel the pull of something greater pressing into the present. So if you believe prophecy is not just metaphor, if you believe it could be closer than we admit, subscribe to Holy Shadows now. Don't wait for the stones to cry out louder. And if you don't believe, if you still think this is performance or poetry, then at least have the courage to say so. Go to the comments. Tell us why you keep watching. Tell us why you cannot look away. Pope Leo did not move from where he stood. He let the silence stretch, not to stall, but to sanctify. He had felt this silence before, in the back of desert chapels, in crumbling monasteries where monks prayed through the night while the world slept. But here, in this hall of marble and microphones, it was heavier, hungrier. He turned back to Dr. Khalidi. There was no scorn in his voice, only clarity sharpened by compassion. You're not afraid of religious panic, Leo said quietly. You're afraid of being wrong. The word struck not as accusation, but as diagnosis. Precise. Unflinching. You fear what you cannot measure, Leo continued. You study the gate with scanners and sensors. You sift soil and date stones. But not everything wholly fits in your microscope. Khalidi's mouth tensed, but he said nothing. His confidence, once smug and unshakable, now looked like armor growing too heavy to wear. The Pope stepped forward, not toward him, but toward the center of the press floor, where cameras could no longer reduce him to a frame. This moment, he said, sweeping the room with his gaze, is not about hysteria. It is not a Vatican stunt. It is not political theater. He paused, not for drama, but to let the room breathe again. This is not fear-mongering. This is the church doing what she has always done, preparing the faithful. Somewhere to the left, a journalist shifted her seat slightly, not to leave, but to lean in. Leo continued, and now his tone deepened. Not louder, but rooted in something eternal. You mock the sign not because it's false, but because you see it too, and you don't want it to be true. That was the moment. The dismantling wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was no need for theological footnotes or archaeological duels. The Pope wasn't defending prophecy. He was exposing resistance. And in that moment, the power dynamic flipped. Dr. Khalidi, who had walked in with authority carved from secular prestige, now looked unsteady. His silence didn't look intellectual. It looked cornered. Because the argument was no longer academic. It was personal. Khalidi had seen something. Perhaps on the ground in Jerusalem. Perhaps in one of the ancient texts he dismissed too quickly. Perhaps in his dreams. The truth, Pope Leo knew, had already breached his fortress of certainty. And that's why the mocking tone had given way to anger. Because beneath all rebellion is fear of surrender. Across the room, more cameras panned toward the Pope. Editors watching live feeds began marking the timestamp. And one by one, even the skeptics in the room began realizing the story was no longer Khalidi versus the church. It was man versus truth. And truth was not losing. And you, sitting behind your screen, you feel it, don't you? Not just curiosity, not just the pull of controversy. You feel the weight of it. The moment you realize this isn't just a debate in a Vatican hall. It's the same debate you've had in your own heart. When signs start to surface. When what you dismissed as myth suddenly becomes motion. When the earth begins to stir and you're not ready. So hear this. This is not entertainment. This is preparation. If you felt even a fraction of what's moving beneath this story, subscribe to Holy Shadows now. Delay is not discernment. It's denial in disguise. And if you still choose doubt, if you still think this is just rhetoric, just fiction, then say so. Go to the comments. Tell us why you still trust silence over warning. Tell us why faith makes you nervous. Tell us why, in the face of everything, you still choose to look away. Pope Leo let the tension settle, not like a man concluding an argument, but like a shepherd calling his flock home. He turned slowly from Khalidi and faced the crowd, not just the journalists and diplomats in the room, but the millions watching across screens. For the first time that afternoon, his voice softened, though it lost none of its weight. This isn't about Dr. Khalidi, he said. It's not about archaeologists or popes or institutions. This is not a debate to win. He stepped forward once, deliberate. This is about whether we still believe in watching. A hush fell deeper across the room. Even the press, trained to interrupt, to interject, to press for the next angle, held their questions like children holding breath. Pope Leo folded his hands before him. There was no paper in them, no script, just memory and conviction. You want certainty. I understand that, he said. But prophecy was never about certainty. It was about readiness. He looked to the side, where the camera lights were blinking. Maybe the gate is moving. Maybe it isn't. Maybe the tremors are coincidence. Maybe they're warning. But if we are not ready, it won't matter. There it was. The final reframing. The press had come expecting spectacle, provocation, conflict, a clash between science and faith. But Leo had given them something else. Not panic, not dogma. He had given them accountability. He continued. The prophets did not cry out to be right. They cried out because they loved a people who refused to see. This isn't about apocalyptic frenzy. This is about spiritual alertness, about looking up, about asking, what if we're closer than we think? There were no gasps now, no whispered reactions, only stillness. And then the final words came, not shouted, not sermonized, but offered like a last lamp in a dark hallway. We do not know the hour, but we know the urgency. He didn't move after he said it. He didn't need to. The room had shifted. Something in it had opened like a gate. And though no one said it aloud, most knew it wasn't just about Jerusalem anymore. It was about the soul, about whether it, too, had sealed itself shut, and whether the watcher at its threshold was preparing to knock. And you, still watching, still listening, you know what that silence meant. You feel it, because deep down, something in you has stirred too, not in fear, but in recognition. So ask yourself this. Are you ready? Are you watching? We tell the stories the world would rather forget. We bring light to signs the world has chosen to ignore. Subscribe to Holy Shadows now. And if you don't, go to the comments. Tell us what's stopping you from standing watch with the rest of us. Because the hour is unknown, but the urgency is not. If you had been there, seated among the hushed crowd, feeling the weight of every word spoken by Pope Leo XIV and Dr. Khalidi, what would you have said? Would you have challenged? Would you have stood silent, caught between doubt and faith? Or would you have dared to speak the truth, trembling in your own heart? This is not just a story to watch and forget. It is a vigil, a call to awaken, a gathering of souls wrestling with questions too profound for silence. So do not hold your thoughts inside. Speak them. Bring your voice to the comments below. Share your fears, your hopes, your convictions. Let this not be the end of the conversation, but its beginning. May we all seek truth with humble hearts, with eyes fixed steadily on the Eastern Gate, and spirits ready for whatever awaits beyond. And if you still haven't subscribed to Holy Shadows, ask yourself, if not now, when? And if never, then write in the comments. Let the world see your answer.